Hello and welcome back to another weekly Brawl Commander tier list. Yo, let's get right into it. So, this is the game plan for this video. We're going to do the overall strategy for this game, this Brawl this week. We're going to talk about some auras, we're going to explain them, and then we're going to have a look at the commander rankings, and then the explanations. So I'm going to have some timestamps in the comment section below, so just have a look at that shit if you just want to skip ahead. But let's dive right in. So, also, before we dive in, actually, if you like this sort of content, if you like Direct Strike content, if you like guides about Direct Strike, subscribe and like my videos and share it to a friend, because honestly, that helps me out a lot, right? And if you say subscribe, you'll be seeing all of my amazing guides that will be coming out very, very soon. But now let's actually get to it. Alright, so the overall strategy. So there's two sort of ways to play this Brawl. So there's the late game, where you just sort of max out, and it becomes a huge, heavy grind, and it's just amazing overall. And there's the early game, where you just coordinate with your team to make a very powerful timed push, and you just end the game around like 10-15 minutes before, you know, it starts getting a little too packed and the lag starts kicking in. So there's sort of two overall strategies to this Brawl. So let's have a look at the auras as to why this Brawl works. So we have first Mercs, Hills Cantina, and Heaven's Devils. Let's explain Mercs first. So Mercs gives you access to three tiers of powerful hybrid. So the hybrid are one-time use only, right? You have like this little building that charges up energy over time, and then each hybrid is worth a certain amount of energy. So the recommended strategy is that you max out energy, and then you just spam 4 hybrid behemoths. So hybrid behemoths are massive. They cost 500 energy each, and they have 2,000 HP, 30 damage, 2 armor, so they're really beefy. They're just there to just soak up damage. And when you summon them, they give 110 minerals. So all the hybrid give minerals when you summon them, each of them based on like their cost. However, an alternative strategy that you can use, which is for tempo, is you can spam hybrid reavers, which are tier 2. So behemoths are tier 3. And hybrid reavers give the most cost effective for energy and minerals. So for 300 energy, you get 65 minerals. So that's the most cost effective hybrid if you're just looking to just get units out on the field. But really, hybrids are really useful for just getting in that one powerful push. Hybrid Reavers have the same stats in terms of armor and attack, but they only have 1,000 HP. They tend to be very useless in the late game, so if you do want to start dropping these guys out in the early game, that would be very good. But late game, they're not so good. You'd rather go for a few behemoths. Now, next, we have Hills Cantina. So Hills Cantina gives you, well, I say 3 tiers, but it's actually 2 tiers of powerful Terran units. And these stay forever. They're part of your wave forever, right? So your recommended strategy is either to mass siege tanks or to mass Vikings. So not everyone has access to siege tanks normally, but now everyone can have access to siege tanks. So now you have an extra unit to stack. Some commanders who don't really have really great siege units can build the siege tanks to support their already powerful waves. And you could go building Vikings, like the Hell's Angels, which are just a little stronger Vikings. But that's only if you don't really have too good of an anti-air sort of answer. And most commanders do have something of that sort. So siege tanks is probably your safer bet. Now, a cheese strategy, if you want to go for an early game push, could just be massing the Marines. So the Marines are available right off the bat, and they only cost, I think, 75 energy. The siege tanks cost 400. But yeah, you can just sort of just dump these guys out, and they'll spawn every single wave. The only problem is they don't scale into the late game, because, you know, they're Marines. They don't do that much damage. They don't have that much health. They'll die horribly later in the game. And finally, we have Heaven's Devils. We start with the random Tychus Mercenary. RNG based, right, and they're all very good at their job. So let's just have a look at the first 2 Mercenaries that we have up here. We have Nux and Sam. Nux is good at AoE, and, you know, he just kills a lot of small units. He can be upgraded to increase, he drops a little side storm that does a lot of damage in a certain area, and the side storm size can be increased, and the damage can be increased. Sam is very powerful at single target DPS. He can take down very high health targets, provided that you don't let him auto cast his bomb. You should target that bomb. Next we have Kev, and we have Tychus himself. So Kev is just a really powerful marauder. He deals really well with armored units, and he can put down a little healing field that gives like a little bit of healing, not really that strong. And then there's Tychus. Tychus is just good all around DPS. Nothing much to be said about that. He has a grenade that can deal pretty well with lots of small units as well. Sirius and Vega. So Sirius can be outfitted to have anti-air missiles, and he can also drop down turrets, and he can also explode when killed. So he's decent against like lots of small melee units. And Vega is really good against big expensive units because she can mind control them and they die after they are mind controlled. As well, she can bring aircraft onto the ground, but she's not that great for DPS. And then we have Blaze and Rob. So Blaze and Rob are arguably like the two of the best tanks. If you roll these guys like Hail Mary, you don't have to build your own tank units. Blaze puts down an oil slick, which slows a lot of enemies in front of him and reduces their damage. And if they're also light units, he will just absolutely incinerate them. And Rob is just a good all-around tank because he doesn't have like an armored or light sort of stat line, so he doesn't take bonus damage from anything, maybe besides Archons. But if your opponent's building Archons against Rob, they're probably doing something wrong. There's better ways to kill him than that. But yeah, so these are Tychus' units. The recommended strategy is really just to use your Merc for the early game. You don't really have to like build anything. They can just, because they always spawn every wave anyways. And they're pretty healthy, they're pretty beefy for the most part. And so by the late game, they sort of become a little pointless, like they don't really do anything, right? But in the early game, they help give you a little cushion, a little barrier. But do keep in mind, your opponent has one too. So, you know, you should probably still build something. Don't sit on your ass. And with that, let's go into the S ranking commanders. So S ranking commanders deal very well with the hybrid. They have very high DPS. They're complemented really well by the hybrid. They're complemented really well by the siege tanks or the Vikings. They scale well throughout the game. They have a powerful late game, and most importantly, they have a very powerful and aggressive early game as well. So our first commander that we have up here is Dahaka. So no surprise Dahaka's here once again, because, well, Dahaka, he just scales deep really well into the late game because he's a giant body, right? Eventually, he starts out with, like, I think, like 500 or 600 HP and, like, a really low DPS, right? But he can spam a lot of Ravasaurs in the early game, which are very efficient ranged attackers, and then he can transition late game into a bunch of different things like Mutalisk or Creeper Host, and he gets like to have like 3,500, 4,000 health, and backed up with the hybrid, it's pretty good. Backed up with siege tanks as well, pretty good. So I have Dahaka up here. His Flame Breath is also very good against a lot of your opponent's more glass cannon backline units, because they will, you know, eventually get one shot by Dahaka's Flame Breath. So that's also why he's up here. You know, I just feel like Dahaka is a really good all-around commander to have. Next, we have my boy Raynor. I don't know if this is a Raynor bias. It probably is, right? But I think Raynor, it does pretty well here because Raynor's siege tanks benefit from fast siege, and the siege tanks that he gets from the Mercenary Cantina will also be affected by this upgrade. So instead of taking 4 seconds siege up, it only takes them 1 second, and these Mercenary siege tanks deal 100 damage. Each hit can be upgraded to maximum 130. So that's a lot of damage coming up, pounding up, right? And if you go aggressive Raynor, right? If you haven't seen my aggressive Raynor guide, go check it out. I'm gonna link it in the description. If you go aggressive Raynor, where you spam Marauders, Fire Blast, you're just gonna go and run over your opponent in the early game, and those are gonna deal very well with the hybrid because Marauders do bonus damage to armor, and armored, like hybrids are all armored, so they'll shred through that. And he doesn't have to build siege tanks. He can just concentrate on purely building Marauders and maybe getting some Vikings to control the air. Next, we have Zagara. So once again, I predict Zagara up here, but maybe I'll be wrong. I just have a little Zagara bias as well because her waves are really powerful, but she takes a little bit of time to ramp up. But once she gets rolling, the hybrid is going to complement her aberrations very well. And because Zagara's wave is naturally powerful, right? She doesn't have any siege units to access, or else that'd be busted. But now the siege tanks can be built with Zagara. And this complements her extremely well because now she can finally stack a wave. And a stacking Zagara, that is a nightmare. Okay, moving on. Let's have a look at the A ranking commanders. So A ranking commanders, honestly, they're still pretty good, right? But like, you know, like the S rank commanders just do a better job. So I wouldn't leave these guys out of the equation at all. Like, they're still very powerful. So the first one I have here is actually Tychus himself, because, you know, Tychus starting with an extra Tychus Mercenary for free is good, you know, obviously. And Tychus has a lot of flexibility with the Hills Cantinas. You can choose to build siege tanks, which will really help, like, your wave stack. You can also build, like, Marauders if you wanted to like, just add more units to your wave, because Tychus struggles with having enough guys in his wave because he only builds like maybe up to like 4, 5, 6 units most of the games, right? If you get really into the late game, he might have 8 or 9 or 10 outlaws, right? But Tychus just sort of struggles having like a lot of numbers. But that being said, right, if he has a few Marauders, like a few Kevs or a few Sams, he will delete those hybrid really quickly. He needs a few Boswells or Blazes to tank at the front. And, you know, Tychus Waves is pretty strong. One of his weaknesses is he just doesn't stack and he doesn't have enough bodies. But he is not lacking in DPS at all. Next, we have Swan. So normally Swan kind of like struggles to actually get to the late game, but because there's so much cushioning from the fact that you can spawn your own mercenaries, you have a Tychus mercenary at the beginning, right? Swan actually has an easier time to glide into the late game, and once he hits the late game and he starts massing Hellbats, Ares, Thors, and tanks, oh my god, that shit is so strong. The only thing that Swan sort of lacks is really being able to keep, I want to say being able to keep like a steady front line. He needs to have lots of Hellbats, I would say. But his tanks will definitely do a very good job against the hybrid, because all the hybrid are armored, and Swan has an upgrade that makes all his tanks, including the siege tanks that you get from the Mercenary Cantina, do plus 40 damage, just total. So if you siege up with his tanks, they do 170 damage per shot, and it does splash damage. So that's fucking insane. I'm pretty sure Swan shouldn't even build his own tanks. He should just rely on the siege breakers you get from the Hills Cantina, and just mass Thors and mass Hellbats. Like, that's one less unit to build. Maybe get Goliaths if you need anti-air. But Swan here is a very strong contender, and for the late game, he's very, very strong. Kind of hard to beat. Next, we have Alarak. So Alarak, I feel like he's always sort of relevant, just because he's really strong in the early game with Alarak the hero, with his supplicants or his chicken nuggets. You know, every time he eats one, he just heals up again. So he has a presence in the early game, so he can go for a strategy that just tries to close out the game really quickly. Or he can go for the late game with Vanguards and Wrathwalkers. So Vanguards are immortals that do AoE splash damage, and are very good against armored units. And Wrathwalkers do lots of single target damage. Alarak could even go... I don't think Alarak should go Void Rays, because Viking mercenaries are a thing. But with the Wrathwalker and Vanguard combo, they will massacre hybrids really easily. Wrathwalkers also deal pretty well with Dahaka, who is S tier, and they will also deal decently against Tychus, maybe until he gets like a Blaze with like the only 30 damage. Although I'm pretty sure Tychus is better off just getting Boswells, like lots of them. But yeah, Alarak's Wrathwalkers are just really good against the other enemies he will be facing, including Swan, because Swan has high armor units, but they don't exactly have a lot of health. But Wrathwalkers should do so much damage, the armor doesn't matter. And last on the A rank, I have Kerrigan. So I have a sort of favoritism for Kerrigan as well, because Kerrigan's Hydralisks do the most, they probably do the most DPS out of like all units, or at least for its cost. It only costs 85 minerals, but it does huge amounts of damage because it shoots so fast. And if you have like 2 or 3 lines of Hydras stacked up, they will absolutely rip through like 4 hybrid behemoths like it's nothing, right? And Kerrigan can also frontline for those Hydras with her really, really powerful Ultralisks that heal when they auto attack stuff, and that have a revive when they die to come back to life, right? The only sort of weakness Kerrigan sort of has is that most of her backline that does a lot of damage is kind of really squishy. It's really fragile, right? The Hydralisks only have they only end up having like around 100 HP with the upgrades. So a Dahaka Flame Breath will scorch most of your Hydras. You know, like, I don't know, Swans, like Thors, if they get on your Hydra line, will obliterate it. Maybe they'll do better against Alarak, but it's just vulnerable to AoE, and especially if your opponent just RNG gets a Nux, you can just level up the Psystorm, and it'll obliterate a good chunk of your Hydras. But that being said, like, Kerrigan's still very, very powerful, not to be underestimated. Next, we have the B ranking commanders. So B ranking commanders have some weaknesses, right? It might just be that like they don't scale as hard throughout the game, or they're not as good at dealing with the hybrid, right? They don't like just delete them off the screen. But they still do good. Like, I feel like this Brawl, like, there's only very few commanders who like absolutely, I would think, suck or have a hard time. Like, most commanders do pretty well. So let's meet the first one. So the first one we have here is Hun and Horner. Hun and Horner doesn't really have too much of a ground presence early on. In fact, Hun and Horner never really ends up having a really powerful ground presence most of the time, because they go air. When you go Asteria Wraiths, and you go Vikings, Deimos Vikings, right? But once Han and Horner manages to transition to Asteria Wraiths and Deimos Vikings, they will do very good. But it's just managing that transition, having to use like your shitty little Hellions and like Hellbats, kind of really sucks in the early game, right? So you might get like knocked out with like an early game like cheese push. I know that certainly did happen in one of the games I recently played. One of my teammates was Han and Horner, and all they could do was just sort of, you know, stay put until they could get to that point. But we got knocked out at I think 12 minutes, right? So there's always that threat. But once Hunter scales into the late game, they still do really well. The steer rates are tough as nails, and they do lots of damage. So they will deal very effectively with hybrid. It's just that the early game is a little weaker. Okay, and next we have Nova. I've seen Nova Bio perform very well, especially with Marauders and the mag rail munitions. So Nova's Marauders just do like burst damage whenever they first contact your opponent's wave. That burst damage is good just overall at killing your opponent's units, and also very good against hybrid. And Marauders, they do bonus damage against armor units, and hybrid are armored units. And Nova's siege tanks are technically better, so she doesn't really benefit from the siege tanks that you get that well. Nova siege tanks, the longer they're sieged up, the more range they gain, up to +5, so they give them like 18 range. So that's huge range, which is what sort of makes Nova's late game pretty strong. But that being said, like, she doesn't really benefit too well from like the Cantina, besides maybe like getting Vikings to help her cover the air, and then she can just max out like a ground force at the bottom. Because like Strike Goliaths aren't really that great like to build for Nova. Like, they're a good like sort of mainstay unit, but in this Brawl they're not that great because everyone's going to be wanting to build anti-armor, and Strike Goliaths only do like average DPS. They have average HP. It might be better to just go Hellbat Rangers and Marauders backed up by Hell's Angels, and her own siege tanks. That might just be a better composition, but like in the face of like all these other very powerful commanders, that might not be enough. But we'll see. It's all depending on like player skill and player decision as well too. Next, we have Stukov. So I have Stukov here because his first sort of strategy, where you just sort of spam lots of infested Marines, infested civilians, doesn't really scale too well later into the game because the hybrid will just make quick work of them. The hybrid just have so much health and armor, and they do AoE slicing damage in front of them. It'll literally just chop them up for mincemeat. But that being said, Stukov does have access to a lot of medium-sized, high HP units, such as his bunkers. As well, he does have excellent siege tanks himself. So that's sort of like the thing. Stukov could build his own siege tanks, or he could rely purely on the siege tanks from Hill's Cantina, and just tempo out lots of bunkers instead. Probably be a good idea because like Stukov siege tanks are very expensive. And if Stukov can hit the late game, his Apocalypse are on par, if not better than the hybrid. Like, I'm pretty sure his Apocalypse could go toe-to-toe with like 2 hybrid behemoths and actually go and come out on top. Like, that's how powerful it is. But he just needs to get there, I think. And it might be a little harder to get there for him this time. Because especially like, with Dahaka looming large, Stukov's like early game strategy isn't really that great later on. It doesn't scale that well. But you just gotta play with that in mind, I think, and Stukov will do pretty well still. Next we have Vorazun. So Vorazun, I don't ever really think is ever out of the running, but like with this Brawl, because everyone has access to Vikings, she might have a harder time keeping her air presence. Yes, she can still go Corsairs. Yes, she can still go Void Rays, and those will all do a very good job at melting hybrids, especially with disruption webs, like disabling enemy auto attackers, right? But the problem is like her wave doesn't really have too much in terms of like just sort of powerful damage. It's all sort of sustained damage over time if you go Stalkers. If you go Dark Templar, they're gonna have a bad time later in the game because just AoE, they're melee, right? So it's a toss-up. It also depends like how well you play her. I don't think she's bad per se, right? Because her Void Rays are alright, but it's just like that fact that she has such a limited pool of units that she can work with makes it really tough for her to really like be able to, I guess, pull some strings and like work around your opponents. But yeah, I don't think she's ever out of the running. Disruption Web still works on the hybrid, still disables them from auto attacking, so she's still definitely playable. Next we have Abathur. So I have Abathur down here in the bottom of the B rank, simply because I'm just considering the sort of long-term like strategy approach. Like for the early game, Abathur's Roaches and Queens are very strong. It's just that he can't really have the ability to build Swarm Hosts because the Locusts will get shredded by the hybrids decently. But that being said, with Critical Massive Locust, it could work out. But I think a Guardian build would be better this this Brawl. Yeah, I don't know. Let's see. We'll see with Abathur. I think Abathur might be a little better, but I'm hesitant to put him any higher because it takes a long time for Abathur's Guardians to really stack up and really get going. But once they get going, oh boy, do they get going. So, yeah, he's just more into the late game, so he's a little bit more vulnerable in the early game. Now, we have some C-ranking commanders. So, C-ranking commanders have many weaknesses, and they either struggle to deal with the hybrid, or they might even struggle to deal with like the one Tychus Merc that's out there. Or they struggle to make use of the siege tanks to complement their build. They might have a strong early mid game, but they drop off in the late game. So let's have a look at our C ranks. So here I have Karax. Right, that's a weird commander to have, right? Isn't Karax very good with those immortals and their shadow cannons? Well, yes, Karax is pretty good in that aspect, but in the late game, Karax's only sort of viable options for a late game unit to stack is either his carriers or his colossi. Now, his carriers won't do that much damage against hybrid because hybrid has high armor, and everyone's going to have access to Vikings, so his carriers are once again a little weaker. And against Karax, you obviously want to be building anti-air. So, his choice of units are going to be so telegraphed. Like, he really only has like 4 or 5 really good units, like Sentinels, right? Like his Reviving Zealot. And then he has his Immortals, and then he has his Mirages, and he has his Carriers, and he has his Colossi. Literally 5 units. So he's like very inflexible. If he gets countered in any single way, like it's game over for him. So that's why I have Karax down here. Like he's still sort of playable, but he's a lot weaker in comparison, I would like to think. Okay, so next we have Artanis. So Artanis is sort of like a weird commander. He's not really like too strong, right? His real specialty, I think, is just dealing with lots of small units, right? His Zealots have a spin. He has High Templar and High Archons that both can cast Psionic Storm. That'll absolutely shred small units. He has Reavers with the Scarabs that explode, doing large amounts of damage to just units in a little AoE. So that's pretty good. But he doesn't really have any AoE in the air. He only has Phoenixes and Tempests, and maybe Artanis can stack Tempests, or maybe he can stack Reavers. But his main strength is dealing with lots of small units. He does have his Immortals that are really tanky, and maybe they'll do well in this Brawl. But I think he's like he's in too far deep, I think, because if you're up against like a Rainer, if you're up against a Nova, their Marauders are just going to wipe the floor. Like, he's going to destroy all your Dragoons, destroy all your Immortals, right? I think Artanis is just not that great for this Brawl. Let's just go with that. And finally, we have our D ranking commanders. These commanders they're just not going to have a good time. So let's just get right into it. So the first one we have here is Phoenix. So Phoenix really only has his early game going for him. So maybe if you play Phoenix, the strategy is just to spam out as many Legionnaires and Adepts as possible, and just try and run it down with Hybrid Reavers and Marines. If that fails, the late game is probably going to be lost for sure. Because once again, Phoenix suffers from the same weakness that Karax does. Right? He can only deal, like his only like sort of stacking options in the late game is a Carrier or a Colossi. Colossi, while really good on the ground, are vulnerable to air units, and everyone has access to Vikings, right? So if people build Vikings, their Colossi are going to be going down. Phoenix also doesn't really have like a good sort of anti-air unit. Like, it's the Scout. The Scout's okay. It never feels that strong. Like, Phoenix's units just don't feel that. They feel antiquated. They remind me of Brood War, because like most of the units are like from the Brood War. Maybe with the exception of the Colossi. So yeah, I don't think Phoenix is going to do too great here. He does have the cheapest Immortals in the game, but still, he lacks that power, that staying power that other commanders have. And lastly, we have Stetman. Stetman's just sort of like a really weird commander. He has no sort of good mid-sized front line, right? Like, not like a really tanky unit, but like, just a decently tanky unit. That's like tier 1 or tier 2. Instead, he has his Zerglings, which can have a damage cap on them. They can only take up to 10 damage, possibly, right? But then Zerglings aren't really that great against like large, heavy units like hybrid behemoths or, whatever powerful units your opponents will be building as the front line. He has his Banelings, which could be useful to just run it down from the early game, backed up by Gary, right? But then those Banelings will stop scaling well into late game because they'll be exploding for 40 damage against a 2,000 health hybrid, right? Or even against a giant like Thick Wave. Yeah, and his Hydralisks are really expensive. They cost 110, much more than Kerrigan Hydras, and they don't do as much damage either. They're really good against air, but like that's about it. And his Ultralisks are okay. They cost a lot of money. They take 25% reduced damage, so they might be good at like options against Immortals, right? But other than that, he doesn't really have too much going for him. Like he has like his Lurkers are also kind of mediocre as well, and he doesn't really have anything to like stack. So that's sort of why I just sort of have Stetman like down here. Like yeah, he might have access to siege tanks, so that'll like help out a bit more. But everyone also is going to have access to siege tanks, and they're just going to do a much better job at keeping the wave alive, and keeping his own wave alive than he is. So that's sort of why I have him down here. But yeah, here's the tier list summarized right here for you guys in a nice little visual graphic. But yeah, other than that, if you guys have any comments about this tier list, just drop me some comments in the comment section below. If you like this video, like it, man. And subscribe if you want to see more Direct Strike content and Direct Strike guides like this. But until next time, see you guys later.